Madam President, I want to thank my colleague, Senator Corker, for his diligent efforts that consumed literally hundreds, if not thousands of hours of effort as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in helping guide us through this very important process, very difficult process. I was on this floor earlier saying this is an issue that rises above partisan politics. This is something that each of us as a senator has to weigh carefully. I have spent, I don't know how many hours and how much time reading through, parsing through, trying to analyze and understand this agreement, its side annexes, and everything connected with it. And I would like to now state to my colleagues, perhaps with an appeal, that they at the very least, set aside this, the deal is done, you lost, therefore we're not even going to allow a vote on this matter. This is one of the most historic, consequential measures that anyone in this chamber will ever be confronted with. I know for me it is the most, because of historic consequences that may occur if we don't get this right. It's important that we debate this and have ample time to go through every bit of this and have each member of this weigh carefully what we hear from each other and what we come to understand on the basis of our own personal examination. And I hope that will be the case. To deny us the opportunity to even let our yes be yes or our no be no before the public, I think would be a tragic mistake. I would like to just go back a little bit and talk about my history with all this. When I returned from my ambassadorship to Germany and actually had to deal with this as one of many different issues, because even back then there was great concern among both the United States and the German government over Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons capability. And I engaged in a number of discussions and diplomatic efforts there in working with our ally country, Germany, on this issue. But when I did come back, and I suppose partly because of my engagement there, I was asked by the Bipartisan Policy Committee that had just been formed to chair a task force on this very issue, the Iranian pursuit of nuclear weapons. We obviously wanted this to be bipartisan, so I recruited my fellow Senate colleague, Chuck Robb, then retired senator from Virginia. And together we co-chaired that. Later we're joined by retired four-star general and Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe, Chuck Wald. And we put together a who's who of experts on the Middle East, experts on nuclear capabilities. We had renowned experts from across the spectrum come and present to us. And all of that resulted in three major reports titled Meeting the Challenge, U.S. Policy Towards Iranian Nuclear Development. The second one, Meeting the Challenge, Time is Running Out. The third, Meeting the Challenge When Time Runs Out. There is a treasure trove of information here about how Iran has violated UN treaty resolutions, violated the Proliferation Treaty Agreement. We have talked about the consequences of all this and made recommendations to the administration, whatever administration that would be. As it turns out, these recommendations went both to a Republican administration under President George W. Bush and to an Obama administration under our current president. Clearly, we had outlined, and in the interest of time, I won't be able to go back through all of this. But let me just state a couple of the conclusions here relative to all this. Absent necessary leverage, we believe it unlikely that Supreme Leader Khamenei will reciprocate President Obama's conciliatory gestures in a meaningful way. We talked about first of all, we endorsed diplomacy to its ultimate, but we recognize that diplomacy has its limits. You can sit at a table and talk and not come to agreement for decades. And we had been trying diplomatic efforts with Iran and they weren't succeeding. And so then we talked about the necessity of having sanctions and ever ratcheting, tightening sanctions to bring Iran to the table. Included in that was the threat of the use of force if all else failed. None of us on that committee were warmongers. We wanted to do everything possible to prevent conflict in solving this problem. And so we laid out a long framework, and perhaps if this continues into next week, I'll be able to go through some of this framework. But the key here on this is stated here somewhere in my the key to this, well, I'll just state it by going through it. The key to all this was that you had to have a combination of tough diplomacy, which we had had years of, and we're going to continue that, backed up by ever-ratcheting sanctions to show Iran that there was a price to pay for not coming to agreement, and then backed up ultimately by the threat of force if we couldn't secure an agreement which would reach the goal. And the goal was to prevent Iran from having nuclear weapon capability, knowing of the destabilization that would take place in the Middle East and the historic impact that this would have and consequences this would have if we allowed that to happen. Now, let me move on to what I believe are major problems with this deal. We know that Iran's misbehavior, its violation of 6 UN treaties that it agreed to, its violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, its support for terrorism, it is a bad actor, perhaps the world's worst bad actor, engaging in weaponization that killed American troops. We're dealing with a rogue nation here. And I don't know how my colleagues react to this, but when they cut a deal with the United States and they're cheering on the streets of Tehran, and the supreme leader comes out yesterday and basically says, well, don't worry, Israel won't be around in the next 25 years. They'll be wiped off the map. We've already said death to Israel. But then and also death to the great Satan, the United States. This is the party that we just negotiated an agreement with. Now, if we had negotiated an agreement that achieved our goals, I would say, good for us. I mean, the sanctions worked. We came up with a good agreement. But as I have read through this document and parsed over every word and tried to find every meaning and over the annexes and talked to the experts. I serve on the Senate Armed Intelligence Committee. Earlier, I served on the Armed Services Committee. I've had more than a decade of experience in this. If I was hoping to read through this document, took it home and spent almost the entire weekend carefully reading this, hoping that we had achieved at least some of, if not most, the most important goals that we had. And to my dismay, we ended up not achieving any of those goals. The goals were to prevent Iran from having nuclear weapons capability that could break out and totally destabilize the Middle East. And what we have come up with is an agreement that puts them on a path to do exactly that, justified now by this agreement, justified by the Security Council at the UN. I said there were 2 major things that needed to be talked about before we talk about some of the specifics. First, the false claim that we must choose between accepting this failed agreement or war, and the second is that the agreement prevents Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapons capability. This is the sales pitch from the White House. This is the sales pitch that is being made to the American people, and neither of these is true. It has to be a desperate administration that has chosen to force this agreement on us by arguing that it's a choice between this deal and war. I'm disgusted by the administration's sales strategy for this agreement. And those who are led down the primrose path of belief that the only option here is war, and therefore, no matter what we gave away, this deal is better than the alternative. The false choice is among the most infamous, cynical, and blatantly false manipulation the Obama administration has used to distort an important debate. And they ought to be ashamed of themselves for using this tactic. In fact, the false argument masks a far more valid argument, one that is that this deal makes future war far more likely, not less, because by abandoning the tool of economic sanctions and giving away a strong, principled negotiating position, the administration's desperate tactic is reducing our options when Iran does go nuclear, as we have put them on the path to do. President Obama and Secretary Kerry have repeatedly said over the past year that no deal is better than a bad deal. They never argued that any deal is better than a no deal, yet that is what they ended up with conceding. We had the strength of 6 of the most powerful countries in the world, the United States, Great Britain, France, Germany, China, and Russia, sitting at one side of the negotiating table. On the other side of the negotiating table was an Iran crippled by sanctions, oil falling into the range of $40 a barrel, which cost them more to extract it and sell than they could get back. They were desperate to achieve some kind of relief from these sanctions. We had the negotiating leverage. We gave away that leverage in these negotiations, desperate to conclude any deal whatsoever so that we could avoid making some difficult decisions down the line in terms of what we had said we must do. 4 presidents, including this president, 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, said it is unacceptable for Iran to achieve nuclear capability. We gave that away just to get them at the table. Just to get them at the table, we took off the use of any force, any leverage, or additional sanctions or continuing of sanctions in order to get to the table. Not as a negotiating to get what we needed, but just to get to the table. The administration has accepted, in my opinion, a deeply flawed deal, then set it in motion with a UN Security Council resolution on the next day, well before Congress could even respond to it. Thank goodness Senator Corker and Senator Cardin were able to convince their colleagues on a 98-1 vote to give Congress the right to have a say in this issue. Had that not happened, the president, by not declaring this a treaty, declaring this as simply an executive agreement, the president would have locked this thing in before we even had a chance to read it, before the American people even had a chance to know what it was, except for what the president told them it was, or his Secretary of State told them that it was. So we're having this debate thanks to these 2 men, these 2 leaders, one a Republican and one a Democrat, who had the courage to stand up to this president and say, no, the American people deserve to have a say. And boy, what a say it is. I don't know about others. My mail's running 10-1 against this. Maybe I'm talking to the wrong people. I don't know. But the more they learn about this agreement, the more they say, are you crazy? You gave up that? For what? What did we get back? Now, I want to go over some of that. I'm trying to move through this because I know time is of the essence here. But this idea that war is the only alternative. And then the sales pitch that I've heard so many of my colleagues and others who support the deal say, you know, I'm for this because this prevents Iran from having a nuclear bomb. It's just the opposite. It gives Iran the pathway to have a nuclear bomb. This has a sunset clause in it, and it releases all the sanctions. It has a sunset clause that says after 15 years, they can do whatever they want to do. We can't reimpose sanctions. What kind of a deal is that? But the false narrative that this will not allow that, the agreement, the annexes even say we have to help Iran achieve nuclear research that can help them move toward this. I looked at the annex and said, surely I'm reading this wrong. We are committed to help them, and if another nation, say Israel, wants to take action against this because they think they're going to be extinguished from the face of the earth, as the Iranians have told them that's going to happen, want to take action, we actually are required to try to convince the Israelis not to do that. We side with the Iranians. I mean, you can't write this script. Yeah, I mean, this is beyond comprehension. So those two false narratives are what we all alone ought to be reason to say, wait a minute, let's not go forward with this deal. Surely we can find a way to negotiate a better deal for us. Now, our Bipartisan Policy Committee, I want to read from this because we looked into this very, very question. And this was the conclusion. Even if Iran were to honor all of its obligations and fully comply with all the restrictions in the agreement, JCPOA, the deal would not prevent a nuclear Iran indefinitely. Starting in year 13, Iran will be able to break out, produce enough fissile material for a nuclear weapon in about 10 weeks, down from 1 year. In year 16, Iran would attain nuclear weapons capability in a breakout time of less than 3 weeks. That was the conclusion, not of Republicans. That was the conclusions of a bipartisan, nonpartisan group of experts, chaired by a Republican former senator at the time and a Democrat former senator at the time. And what we have said actually has come true. The Sunset Clause should by itself be enough to persuade, hopefully, a majority of us to reject this deal. It just doesn't make sense. You know, if President Bush in 2001 had presented to the American people this same deal with Iran and secured the votes to pass this deal, today, Iran would be having a breakout, unrestricted breakout, assisted by the agreement, and we're going to call that a diplomatic victory. 15 years is going to go by very fast. They're going to have breakout capability much earlier than that, and they can easily, if you read the agreement, easily declare that we've breached the agreement and they're pulling back and therefore they're going forward. And they'll have well over $100 billion to use to achieve that effort. They will have sanctions relief, total sanctions relief. They'll be able to export all the oil that they want, and Iran wins. Now, there are some particular problems with this, and they've been listed by people as on the right, Charles Krauthammer, on the left, or at least in the middle, David Brooks, of the New York Times, not exactly a Republican rag, and David Brooks not necessarily a far right-winger, basically saying every single major goal that we had going into this agreement has been given away in a desperate attempt to achieve any agreement so that we don't have to deal with this, what we have to deal with can be pushed down the road. And so on that basis, I went through the agreement and looked at some of these areas, and I would like to identify and make for the record those that we had the leverage to achieve, a goal, stated goal by the administration and by others in the negotiating to achieve, and we caved on every one of them, every one. First, verification and inspections. Most people understand that anytime, anywhere means anytime, anywhere. Actually, now it means, well, a minimum of 24 days if Iran agrees with us initially that we should go through this, a convoluted process which Iran helps make the decisions, like giving Tom Brady and the Patriots the right to determine whether or not the footballs were deflated. Now I'm from Indiana, it's Colts, and they whipped us in the Super Bowl, and I'm probably biased in that statement. On the other hand, just to simplify it for people, if you have an adversary that you don't trust and you want to have the ability to find out whether or not what they say or do is true, you don't say, well, go ahead and check it yourself and then tell me what you think, and we'll take that for an answer. So talk about caving anytime, anywhere on inspections. The administration also argued this principle of short notice, and Secretary, when asked this, Kerry, when asked this at one of our meetings here, basically said, no, I think I got the quote here. He said, we never pursued such a goal, and indeed we never heard of it. I, along with every one of us here, was relieved when the administration announced, I don't know if it was Secretary Kerry or one of his team supporters, announced inspections anytime, anywhere. Everybody said, oh, okay, at least we have that. Now we learned no American can be a part of the inspection team. Now we learned that a UN independent agency will do the inspections. And now we've learned that there are off limits to military and a former weapons manufacturing and research facility that we're not even allowed to inspect. And so anywhere, anytime has become a farce. And how can you possibly get that in and of itself would be reason not to vote for this agreement. How do you go home and explain to people anytime, anywhere is a scrubbed version of 24 days at a minimum as long as Iran agrees? You know, it doesn't take somebody with a PhD or a law degree or even a senator or a congressman who's delved in these issues for people to say, are you nuts? Who would sign a deal like that? Uranium enrichment. We cave there. And then talk about, you know, one of the key weaknesses is the agreement that the centrifuges are to be disconnected and only stored feet from their original position. They can be reintroduced into the enrichment system when the earlier expiration dates of the deal occur whenever the Iranians choose to move quickly toward nuclear capability. This involves some highly technical stuff, but the bottom line is almost all aspects of these enrichment details are in dispute by experts who understand this technical application of all this, and they're not persuaded by the misleading leadership coming out of the administration. Once again, another cave. Fordo, what was Fordo? Fordo is a facility at which some nuclear technology pursuit was being undertaken, and we wanted to be able to shut that down. But the Iranians said, no, don't think so. So we said, oh, okay, let's cave on that. Let's move on to something else. The same applied to military dimensions and undisclosed military facilities. Secretary Kerry faced again with Iranian intransigence, explained his new position now. He no longer was fixated on the past. That was something that we talked about months ago. I'm not fixated on that anymore. So scratch that one off. Don't worry. Keep Fordo open. No problem. What's next? Okay. Sanctions relief. This agreement does not generally relieve sanctions pressure as originally intended, but rather abandons the sanctions regimes entirely all at once. Indeed, the multilateral sanctions are now already gone. European nations and others are flocking into Tehran to sign long-term agreements that will never be subject to sanctions if they're, quote, snap back. We lost again. And so the reimposition of sanctions, if we find out that something is wrong here, it's a farce. It's not implementable. I talked about snapback here. I'm going to move forward on that. This is one I mentioned before, but I still can't comprehend it. The deal obligates the P5+1, that's the 6 of us, the 6 nations that we're negotiating, obligates us to actually help Iran build up its nuclear infrastructure during the 15 years before they achieve a three-week breakout. So we're actually helping them construct their nuclear infrastructure, which then can easily be converted to breaking out for a nuclear weapon. And in return for altering their timetable for nuclear industrial development, the Iranians secured not just international acceptance of that activity, but actual assistance in pursuing it. That's incredible. We're actually helping Iran get to the bomb. And as we hear from some of our colleagues and others who support the agreement, I'm voting for this because this prevents Iran from getting a bomb. Read the agreement. It's not easy to read. It's not fun to read, but it's alarming to read. I was in the Senate in the 90s. And the negotiations, actually Wendy Sherman, who principal negotiator along with Secretary Kerry of this agreement, was principal in the North Korean agreements. And I remember being told on this floor by the President of the United States, through the President of the United States, then President Clinton, and his Secretary of States and others, don't worry. We have total verification procedures in place. If they cheat on us, we're going to know it. And when we know it, we're going to stop it. Well, here it is, 2015. North Korea has somewhere between 20 and 40 nuclear weapons sitting on top of ballistic missiles, and we didn't know it. So that makes me a skeptic going into the thing, because it's like deja vu here. It's like being told the same kind of thing. Don't worry, we'll know if they cheat. We'll be able to do something to stop them. This is the assurance that this is a good deal. So that's a hard sell for me. It's a no sell for me. Because I didn't end up voting for that, because I had some real suspicions about whether or not that would take place. But actually, that ought to be a lesson for all of us here, that something that is promised by the President of the United States and his Secretary of State and his negotiating team won't necessarily come true and be the case. And so the promises that have been made about what this agreement is and what it isn't and what we'll be able to do, I measure those in the way, what didn't work out real well with North Korea, and yet the same negotiator who did that helped negotiate on this. I don't know if my colleague from Tennessee is standing because I'm running long on this. I got a lot more I would like to say. I'm going to try to move to a couple of last things here. Some prominent people have been noted here as favoring the deal. Well, I think Henry Kissinger is someone that probably has the experience at the age of 90-some years and a lifetime in diplomacy, and I don't have to give his credentials. And George Shultz also have some credibility on this. And if you want to listen to one side, you ought to listen to the other. They said, and I quote, "Previous thinking on nuclear strategy assumed the existence of stable state actors. How will these doctrines translate into a region where sponsorship of non-state proxies is common, the state structure is under assault, and death on behalf of jihad is a kind of fulfillment?" And sadly, their views have been largely ignored and not mentioned by anybody else. So if they're going to mention their guys, we're going to mention our guys. Look, the last thing I want to say here before I conclude is there hasn't been much discussion about the consequences, which I think should be a core issue, the consequences for Israel, our only democratic ally in the region. Prime Minister Netanyahu was here. He spoke to a joint assembly of Congress. He received standing ovations for standing tall and standing hard and saying, the very future existence of my nation is at risk here. And he made the point that a bad deal is not better than no deal, that no deal, a bad deal could be worse than no deal, and that there were ways around this. And we cannot ignore the major risks that Iran will follow through with their often repeated threats of obliterating the state of Israel, a threat that was just repeated by the Supreme Leader yesterday. In conclusion, I would ask 1 minute to conclude here.
Is there objection?
I thank my colleagues. With this agreement, we have paid too much and gained too little. The risks are not adequately acknowledged and not effectively addressed. I cannot support this agreement. I cannot approve the misguided desperation that led to it. I cannot understand those who claim this is a great victory for diplomacy, nor those who turned a blind eye to its obvious failings because of the appeal of party discipline, nor those who have fallen prey to the Obama administration's manipulation of the deal with the UN prior to Congress having any say in this. When I read about the gloating, the boastful joy in Tehran, in Tehran, their capital, that all their needs were met and that none of their red lines were crossed, I despair. I despair because this misadventure has been a failure of vision, a failure of will, and a historic failure of leadership. And I fear that these failures will lead to great suffering. We have seen this before. Peace at any price is not peace. Peace at any price sometimes leads to tragic consequences. In the last century, we saw the loss of tens of millions of lives because the goal was to seek peace at any price. We cannot make that mistake again. I yield the floor.